Welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio, a project of the Center for Stateless Society. I am your host, Zachary Woodman. Joining me today is Roderick Long. If you spend much time looking at the work at C4SS or any work in the market anarchist tradition in the last 20 years, you've likely come across Roderick's work and surely have encountered something inspired by or responding to it. Dr. Long is a professor of philosophy at Auburn University, president of the Molinari Institute and Molinari Society, editor of the Industrial Radical and the Molinari Review. He is a founding member of the Alliance for the Libertarian Left, an original founding member of C4SS, and a senior fellow at the Center for Stateless Society. His work centers on the intersections of ethics, especially in the Aristotelian tradition, political philosophy, especially in the Libertarian anarchist tradition, and philosophy of social science. You can find Dr. Long's writing on his blog, the Austro-Athenian Empire, Bleeding Heart Libertarians, and of course at c4ss.org, among other places. Today's discussion centers around Long's work on libertarian class theory, as well as the normative concerns that rise out of such a theory on balancing distributive justice and relational justice concerns with individual liberty. As we will discuss, libertarian class theory sees a primary creator and enforcer of class distinction as the state. There is a wide range of discussion that touches on the economic and sociological analysis of this class theory. At the heart of Roderick's work on the issue, the empirical plausibility of this theory, and whether class distinctions of this sort would continue to exist under market anarchism. We also go into the ethical and normative framework of justice that motivates this theory. Roderick draws from Aristotelian virtue ethics to bring seeming contradictions between a concern for individual property rights and a concern for the equal treatment of all in society into balance in very interesting ways. This was an extremely good, informative discussion of the sort C4SS has become quite well known for, and I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed having it. Just to set the stage a little more, this was recorded at the Eastern Division meeting of the American Philosophical Association earlier last month. Roderick, through the Molinari Society, organized a panel with himself, William Nava, Jason Lee Bias, and myself, where we presented papers on new work in anarchist philosophy. The following day, Roderick and I went out to lunch with a few others from the center. We then went up to my hotel room to record this fun conversation off the cuff. I'm frankly surprised it went so well with so little preparation. But without further ado, here is my conversation with Roderick Long. Welcome to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I'm your host, Zachary Woodman. Joining me today is Roderick Long from Auburn University. We are at the Eastern APA in Philadelphia. So hello, Roderick.
Hi, good to be here.
So today we're going to discuss some of your work on libertarian class theory and what some of the normative implications of it are, how it differs from other class theories, and maybe why it is a superior one to other possible class theories. So maybe we should start, before going into your account, with a general idea of what a class theory is and what we want it to capture, what it should capture.
Okay, so a class theory is meant to explain certain kinds of power relationships among different groups in society. And the one that's best known is sort of the Marxist theory of classes, according to which what determines the distinction between what determines the ruling class's status is control over the access to the means of production. And so under capitalism, the capitalist class controls the means of production, and the proletariat doesn't have access to the means of production, factories, land, etc. Now, and this is the idea behind this. Then is to explain what's wrong in society, why it is that some groups are systematically underprivileged or oppressed, and what needs to be changed. Now, in fact, in the libertarian tradition, there are sort of at least two different versions of libertarian class theory. So there's one that's like it's like a substitute, a switch. Well, I say it's a switch as though it's a response to Marxist class theory. It's actually on the whole older than Marx, but there's a version that simply says the basis for the ruling class isn't access to the means of production; it's access to political power or the political means and
the resources of the state.
Yeah. So the idea is that it's on the classical Marxist view, although it actually turns out to be more than one classical Marxist view. At least on one sort of very familiar version of the Marxist view, classes emerge through the market, and then the ruling class seizes power, seizes the state. That's not Marx's only story, but that's like one way the story seems to go. And then there's this sort of traditional libertarian or classical liberal version, according to which it's state privilege that creates this ruling class, and so the problem that needs to be addressed is the state power and not the economic distribution. But there's also a more lefty version of the libertarian version, which looks like a fusion of the Marxist and classical liberal versions, although all three of these are all roughly rising around the same time. So it's not, and actually, to some extent, the Marxist view might be like the latest of the three. So you get people like Thomas Hodgkin and so forth, like very early left libertarian class theorists. And to put it anachronistically, this view looks like a cross between the classical liberal theory and the Marxist theory, in that they see the concentration of ownership of the means of production as resulting from state power, but they do see the concentration of ownership of the means of production as the problem, as opposed to other sort of more right-wing versions of classical liberal theory that don't really focus that much on ownership of the means of production and think it's just a matter of state control. And so for a more right-wing version of classical liberalism, the oppressed classes might easily include, they might or might not, depending on the details, but they might easily include people with vast economic resources, on the grounds that they got those resources through market means, not through the state. Whereas the left libertarian view tends to be that, in fact, most vast disparities of wealth are the result of state privilege, not the result of the market. Now, as I said, the Marxists, they sort of have two views, because there's in some senses the official Marxist theoretical view, according to which markets give rise to economic inequality, and then the super privileged under markets are then in a position to get control of the state. But then when Marx is talking about history, then he talks as though state privilege has been part of it all along, and that state privilege has been driving it. And he makes fun of the idea, when he's talking about history, Marx makes fun of the idea that it talks like a bourgeois fairy tale or something, that it's just through greater thrift and industry that the wealthy classes got their excess wealth. He says no, the history of capital accumulation is written in letters of blood and fire or whatever. But a lot of later Marxists have sometimes downplayed that. So, for example, in the ABC of Communism by Bukharin and Preobrazhensky, two people who had the misfortune of being to the left and to the right of Stalin and paid the price in both cases. But anyway, before that, they wrote what was sort of the Soviet Union's standard intro Marxist textbook. And in the ABC of Communism, they say, well, look, capitalism isn't the same thing as having a commodity, a market with commodities and production, for exchange and so forth. That's not capitalism. You don't have capitalism until you have the concentration of ownership of the means of production with a capitalist class, so everyone else is forced to work for them. But
market's not capitalist.
Right. But the problem, they say, with simple commodity production is that it's unstable, that it automatically tends to turn into more concentrated capitalism because some people are thriftier or smarter and so forth, and they accumulate more and eventually become super wealthy and they get control of everything. And they say, and we can see that is what actually has happened. And so they implied that the existing disparity in wealth actually arose out of a simple commodity production through just some people being thriftier and smarter, the very thing that Marx had dismissed as a bourgeois fairy tale. And so there's this kind of bifurcation in the Marxists as to exactly the state and state power sort of crucial to sort of accumulation when they're trying to refute the people who say that the capitalist class got wealthy just through their own efforts. But then when they're trying to justify not having markets and private property, then the role of the state seems sort of to vanish. But then over on the on the classical liberal or libertarian side, sort of you've got the you got the early class theorists, like in France, people like Charles Comte and Charles Dunoyer and Augustin Thierry, who have this view about the state power, but they are in some sense, and saw themselves as champions of the bourgeois class. And Charles Comte, for example, says, see some people living in mansions and other people living in hovels. Your initial response is, oh, this is unjust. But once you realize that this is the result of the free market, then you'll realize it's okay. Whereas someone like Hodgkin would have said, what the hell are you talking about? Look at the actual history. They didn't get this way. And then someone like Thierry ended up, in a way, sort of being the same kind of champion for bourgeois class rule that Marx became for proletarian class rule. That is to say that once initially he thought, no one should be in charge of the state. He was, if not quite an anarchist, at least close to it. And says the problem is just having anyone in charge of the state at all. We need to, to radically decrease state power. But by the end of his career, he was saying, now that the French Revolution has happened, and now that the bourgeois class is in control of the state, now it's great and wonderful because they're a class that can be trusted. They won't confuse it and won't power it because they are the third estate. Their interests are identical with the interests of everyone, and so he has the same kind of what seems to me like the naivete that Marx had about the proletarians. He has about the bourgeois. They're thinking that they'll that once they're in power they'll continue to represent society as a whole or something like that. So my favorite class theory is more along the lines of Hodgkin. I think that vast disparities in wealth are difficult to maintain in a free market, because if you've got open competition, then if some people are getting much wealthier than other people, you can imitate what they're doing and compete a lot of that wealth away from them. And unless there's some kind of barriers,
economic profit falls to zero.
Yeah, unless there are things like intellectual property and so forth, because the main function of intellectual property is to prevent you from imitating what other people are doing. That's what it is, and they would like to expand that as far as possible. And protectionism is a kind of intellectual property. I had the idea of building a restaurant here, so I don't want anyone else to build a restaurant anywhere near me because that takes my idea away. And so on the left libertarian version of class theory, the problem looks similar to what the Marxists identify as a problem, namely concentrations of capital ownership of the means of production, such that most people have no choice except to perform wage labor for a smaller group of people. But their account of how it arose and what maintains it, not just how it arose historically, but what continues to maintain it, it has a lot more to do with violent intervention, particularly, although not solely, but particularly by the state.
So there's a lot in there to unpack. I guess maybe the first question that one might have, especially if one comes from a more naive or vulgar libertarian background, or maybe a more centrist liberal background, is why should we want a class theory to begin with? They might think all it is bad social science, that all it is this ideologically informed attempt to account for the distribution of income, and all we need is to understand certain economic processes to understand why income is distributed. Or they might think that if we're going to be methodological individualists, it doesn't make sense to talk about classes as operating as these large social features. So why should we want a class theory to begin with?
You shouldn't want one unless it's true. So it's not like there's just a general need for a class theory. I think there's good reason to think it's true. But so let's start with the last bit. Is a class theory consistent with methodological individualism? Mm-hmm. Now, of course, methodological individualism is not always understood by everyone in exactly the same way.
Right.
But a class theory doesn't have to say that classes act as some sort of agents over and above their members or anything like that.
Right. Although Marxists sometimes slip into that.
They sometimes talk that way. They don't always when they're being more careful. Heck, I think libertarians sometimes talk that way too when they're not being careful. But actually, to some extent, I think you can have a class theory you could have many elements of a libertarian class theory, even if you had, even if none of the people were intending anything. I don't think that's the case. But so here's what I have in mind. Suppose that the wealthy people have no intention of actually trying to maintain themselves as a class. But suppose that the state isn't actively trying to serve them. Imagine the state is just passing laws at random. Just random laws, whatever. Some laws benefit the rich, some laws benefit the poor, some benefit them both, some harm them both. Just the state just generates things like a random number generator. I don't think that's what happens, but imagine it did. Then there's going to be a filtering process. If something affects the interests of the rich have lobbyists. They've got time. They've got lawyers. They've got they can be they're in a position to be aware of what's happening. They've got the resources to fight it and combat it and lobby against it, and so it's going to be harder for those to get passed or easier for them to get repealed. Whereas the poor people are too busy working their dispersed interest. They don't have the time, or often they don't have the education to know what to do, don't have the money to fight it. And so even if the government passed laws at random, I think there would be a tendency for the laws to end up favoring the rich over the poor on average, right, for that reason. So, that doesn't involve any conscious intentions for anything. Now, once you
that should be a basic insight of like public choice economics.
Yeah. And once you add conscious intentions, it doesn't necessarily mean that all members of the ruling class, have some strong feeling of class solidarity with each other, because often they're rivals. I mean, they'll cooperate to hold down any dangerous outsider, but in all these coalitions, each one wants more power than the other. So you've got I don't think the capitalists are all all marching arm in arm, and I don't think that the state and I don't think the state is just a purely passive tool of the capitalist class. The people working within the state have their own interests that aren't identical with, although they're symbiotic with, the capitalist class. It's a partnership where each one would like to be the dominant partner, just like church and state in the Middle Ages. So there's jockeying for power, and so when people think that big government and big business are at odds, I think that's mostly an illusion, but there's a kernel of truth to it that there are genuine conflicts. There are cases where people on this side want one, people on this other side want something else, and likewise, people in government, people in business are not completely unified either. But nevertheless, there are certain overall common tendencies. There are certain things that there are some things that if you lobby, if you're trying to protect your company by lobbying to make the economy generally less competitive, to make it harder for other people to come along and compete with you, that's also going to protect other already established interests and so forth. And then there will be there'll be cooperation among these things. I mean, if a bunch of corporations get together and lobby, they can be more effective, and they will sort of trade favors with each other, and then people in the government are trading favors with each other. But it's not some kind of harmonious class solidarity. It's not that the capitalist class as a whole, or that the government as a whole, or anything as a whole just acts as an agent. But nevertheless, people's incentives will often lead them to act in systematically coordinated ways.
And they might cultivate an ideology such that, not that they act all uniformly, but that they have this.
Yeah, I'm not saying there's no
sense of belonging or something.
Yeah, I'm not saying that there's no such thing as as class solidarity. Well, part of what I mean is that class solidarity isn't necessary for this to happen.
Right.
But certainly.
And class solidarity doesn't undermine methodological individualism.
Right. But certainly, it's often likely that people in privileged groups, tend to relate to other people in privileged groups and tend to think of themselves as sort of naturally belonging where they're belonging, and tend to see, outsiders as interlopers, and when these people they go to similar to similar schools and similar functions and hang out together, and they form friendships and social ties and form sort of common views of the world. Often, not always, but yeah. So I'm not saying that there's no class solidarity, but there's multiple things going on that sort of reinforce the overall effect.
So the overall answer to that objection is that, there's a line in Mises where he says, like, analysis of nations doesn't undermine methodological individualism, and it's for similar reasons to that you can have a group of individuals not consciously interacting with each other, but the class can emerge as an emergent phenomenon, to use Hayekian phraseology.
Yeah, now a lot of people criticize class theory. Why the two criticisms they often make. One is they'll say, well, just conspiracy theory.
Right.
So the answer is, well, sometimes these things are conspiracies. Sometimes you actually find evidence that these people are collaborating, because the more concentration of power that you have, the easier it is for these people to talk to each other and cooperate. And sometimes it doesn't even count as a conspiracy, and since often they just they're doing it fairly in the open.
Yeah.
But also, it doesn't there doesn't always need to be a conscious conspiracy. Often people's economic interests will just lead them to act in the relevant way.
Yeah, that seems like a confusion of the pointing out latent functions, to use a sociological term, of class with people thinking it's a intended function of it.
And the other criticism that you often hear, particularly on the right, of class theory is, well, this is driven by envy. If you think that the rich are getting rich illegitimately, you're just saying it out of envy. Well, the answer is, well, let's look and see why they're getting rich. If it turns out, in fact, they're getting rich through systematic government privilege that is restricted,
or other illegitimate means.
Yeah, if it turns out that the highwayman has a lot more money than the rest of us because he's been robbing us all. No, is it envy exactly that makes us resent him? It's resentment, but it seems like it could be perfectly justified resentment. In any case, even if there's envy involved that is a motivation for getting people interested in class theory, that doesn't make class theory false. You have to look and see what the evidence is. So
the other objection we might make, and this is one that's not just a problem for the class theory, but for the broader project of left market anarchists, is the possibility that we're wrong about the empirical question about what causes disparities in wealth, or that even if we're right about that question under current economic conditions, that in a purely free market there would be massive disparities that would recreate these sorts of classes. And you don't necessarily have to be a Marxist to think that. You could find some mechanisms within sort of broadly within neoclassical economics, like Piketty tries to explain that. So what do you think are the arguments against those sorts of possibilities?
Well, I mean, obviously we don't have complete predictive knowledge of what would happen in a fully freed market. So I don't think we can say with absolute certainty, there's nothing that would create, large systematic disparities in wealth. But, we can just look and say, well, look at what's causing them now. Look what the overall effect is. It's like if you see someone just hobbling along and they've got like a 200-pound sack on their back and they're hobbling along with difficulty, and you could say, well, you can help them by getting that sack off their back, and you would say, well, who knows, if you got the sack off their back, maybe that would cause something else that would make them hobble even worse. It's possible, but it seems like it's not at least initially the way to bet. The way to bet is, well, if there's something that's systematically causing a problem, getting rid of it might get rid of the problem. And of course, sure, social phenomena are complicated and interconnected in various ways, and it's not like you remove one thing and you can just easily predict what everything else is going to happen. So but we just have to go by our best guess, and our best guess is that when we look at what actually seems to be causing these disparities, that it's there always seems to be this this hand of force involved.
Let's go into that best guess. Sorry, let's go into the reasons you have for that and possible other reasons. So, let's start with the reasons you have for that. For thinking that, what are discrete empirical pieces of evidence that current disparities in wealth are caused largely by state control and intervention?
Okay, so I mentioned IP as something that prevents people from imitating, wealth generating activity. You've got sort of the various kinds of, the more obvious kinds of subsidies to corporations, but there are sort of various indirect ones. Like, Kevin Carson likes to talk about transportation subsidies. So for example, the fact that the vast share of wear and tear on the roads is caused by these big shipping companies, but they don't pay a proportional share of the taxes for maintaining the roads, which means that in effect tax-funded highways end up being a subsidy from everyone else to these big box companies and so forth. You've got various kinds of protectionist legislation that helps big companies. You've got
certain sorts of trade restrictions.
Yeah, you've got
regulatory capture and the like.
You've got what I call the capture of the labor movement. So sort of more traditional right-wing libertarians see the labor movement as the beneficiary of the state, and they see the overall effect of labor legislation is that it empowers unions at the expense of employers. But the left libertarian analysis is, if you look at it in its totality, not just look at sort of individual pieces of legislation that seem to be benefiting unions, but look at it in its totality. The effect seems to have been, and indeed seems to have been intended to be, in effect, to defang the labor movement, to make it a kind of junior partner in the big government business thing. Mm-hmm. So, yes, you get these legal rights unions, but there are restrictions. The government can tell you when to strike, and it can rule out sympathy strikes and various things, so that it's so the right-wing libertarian analysis of unions is it's just a cartel to raise labor prices. But in fact, traditionally, for a lot of the labor movement, it was something more than that. There really was a goal to try and get something more like labor control of industry, and it's turned into a bunch of little labor cartels because that was something easier for government to deal with, and so a lot of labor legislation has been driven in that direction. And then, just sort of broadly, Kevin has another nice distinction between what he calls primary and secondary regulations. So there are all these regulations that look as though they're designed to help the less affluent, but often they turn out to be, ways of highly visible ways of mitigating the effects of less visible regulations that are just part of the basic framework. But so take a very straightforward example. So back in the Reagan administration had this deregulation of the savings and loan industry. It said, okay, they had lots of restrictions on how risky loans they could make, and they took those restrictions off. So it looks like to a lot of people, it looked like a reduction in the free market move, and it caused a lot of problems. But from a more careful analysis, you'll say, well, look, what had happened was first they gave them this the federal deposit insurance, saying if you make excessively risky loans, you go and you're in danger of going out of business, running out of money, the taxpayers will insure and cover your losses. But given that we want these regulations on you that you can't do stuff that's too risky, so they gave them a government privilege and then restricted how they could use it. Then the deregulation comes along, and what it does is it took away the restriction without taking away the privilege. So now the savings and loans were free to gamble with the taxpayers' money, knowing that their losses would likely be covered. So they did that,
and that was worsened by bailouts. Which
and so what looked like a move in the direction of less regulation really wasn't. Another example is liability caps for things like oil spills and so forth, where if a company knows that there's a limit to how much it can be sued for, in case of an oil spill, then they're going to be sort of less conscientious about avoiding those things. They'll take more risks. And so those are some of the ways in which, and then things like, just basic things like starting a business, the kinds of regulatory hoops you have to go through to start a business, which if you're wealthy and established, it's easy. You can jump through those hoops. You've got the lawyers, you've got the time. But if you're just a very small business or an entrepreneur, or you're someone in the inner city who just wants to start a hair braiding business, or if you want to start your own taxi service, and all you've got is you've got a car and a cell phone, which is all you need to run a taxi service, really. But there are all these regulations. Lately,
medallion services, what have you.
If you those medallions would cost like something $100,000, and there's a big difference between, the number of people who can afford a business whose capital equipment is a car and a cell phone is a lot larger than those who can afford a car, a cell phone, and a $100,000 license. And although things like Uber and Lyft have liberalized that a little bit, there's still a centralized corporation. They've managed to get certain kinds of exemptions sometimes. It's an ongoing fight.
And they're using the intellectual property to have barriers on who can use it.
So it's not, so Uber and Lyft, they haven't made it such that just anyone can go and just start their own ride-sharing service, without any legal hassles. So I mean, they're improvement, I think, over the pre-existing situation, but another example would be another thing that would be really easy for less affluent people to start as restaurants if they could just start something in their own home and using their own kitchen, but zoning rules that out. Or another thing is daycare. Just all these cases where actually my mother wanted to start a daycare / sort of nursery school with some of her friends. They would take care of the kids while some of the mothers would be working and others would be taking care of the kids of the other ones. Anyway, it turned out that in order to do that, they had to have a huge amount of money up front to pay various kinds of fees and licensing, and they had to have degrees in education. You didn't need a degree in education to take care of your own kid, but you needed degrees in education to take care of each other's kids, and so they couldn't do it. And it just goes on and on. And
my mother with therapy had to go into grad school just so she could be a therapist in the state of Michigan, or be a social worker even in the state of Michigan, and go to grad school that was licensed. Not that the grad school was licensed, but they had to have a partnership with the Michigan State licensure so she could get the license directly through the grad school.
And I mentioned that the hair braider were a lot of cases where in order to have a hair braiding business, you have to get a certificate that requires taking a course for doing lots and lots of different things with hair that they weren't planning to do.
Right.
And of course, the course also costs a lot of money. And I remember there was this was a while ago, I don't know if it's still true, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is, that in Louisiana there was this controversy about how difficult it was to enter the florist business. And you had to have this very difficult process of getting a license to be a florist, because we all know the damage that people can do with unlicensed flower arrangements. And it turned out that the people in charge of granting licenses to new florists was a board staffed by people from existing florists who were being asked to authorize their competitors, and so of course they tended to be a little
and there are examples in the drug industry where to prove equivalence of a generic drug to a name brand drug, you have to prove chemical equivalence. So you have to send in a sample from your would-be competitors, like from Pfizer or who have you, and of course Pfizer never sends you the sample, so that's the way. So of course, I'm talking about things at a very small scale, like hair braiding and florists, but also things like the government sending in the army to protect the interests of large corporations and various third world countries, and this happens at every
at a level of scale.
Right, and this has the effect both of stopping the poor from accumulating wealth by starting their own business and stuff like that, and also by increasing prices for various things for that disproportionately affect the worst off.
Yeah.
So I mean, these are all effects that you don't need to be a left libertarian to acknowledge. I think Rob Reich, in his book on inequality, acknowledges a lot of this, and he's like a progressive economist. Stephen Telles, and who's his co-author for The Captured Economy, has a whole book on this, and then they're relatively centrist progressives and libertarians. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to be a libertarian to acknowledge all that, but you still might think, yeah, that's all true about our existing economy, but even if you had a purely free market, maybe they might cite Piketty's analysis of how under markets, the rate of return on capital is bigger than the growth rate, and so that causes disproportionate returns on those who already have capital. And they might think that, therefore, there are reasons to believe that even in a completely free market, you still have these disproportions of these massive problematic, unequal distributions. So what's your general thought on those types of accounts?
Well, I think it underestimates the entrepreneurial potential of people, working on their own, not working for these big firms. The ability to produce stuff that doesn't rely on these guys. So it's one thing to have accumulated, because it's not just that you've accumulated capital in the past, but the ability to keep on doing it in the face of the just massive storm of upstart stuff. Because look at all the things all the businesses people start or try to start and get squashed down. But all the I think there's a massive entrepreneurial drive from people that are constantly trying to start something, and then they get everything from selling loose cigarettes in the street to whatever, or selling drugs, whatever it is. There are a lot of things that don't require a lot of capital up front. So it's not just the the accumulation of capital, that it's the prohibition on free entry into a lot of these things.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I hope you are enjoying this conversation with Dr. Long. If you are, you can find more content like this at the Center's website, c4ss.org. You can find previous episodes of this show posted there, as well as a number of different articles, books, zines, and discussions on the theory and practice of market anarchism. If you follow C4SS's blog, Roderick typically posts updates about upcoming Molinari Society events at other academic discussions all over the country, including ones like this one we had in Philadelphia. So if there's one near you, you could join us for conversations like this and see the papers presented at those meetings in person. Further, you can buy swag such as t-shirts, buttons, stickers, and books and zines, including previous essay collections and mutual exchanges, also available on the website at store.c4ss.org. This show and everything else the Center does would not be possible without our generous donors and patrons. If you want to support the show and all the other work the Center does, you can go to patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's patreon.com/C4SSDOTORG. I'll have more information about how you can support the show and the bonus goodies you get for doing so at the end. But for now, let's go back to my conversation with Roderick Long. All right. So moving on a bit from that question, one might think that there are other ways, not just through the market, but through other cultural forces that classes are created. They might have an intersectional analysis of class in terms of gender, in terms of race, and what have you, probably race being the biggest one. They'll point out that in America, poverty is largely a feminized phenomenon. It's largely a racialized phenomenon. Historically disenfranchised racial groups tend to be poor. The poorest people tend to be women with children. Single women with children, I'm sorry. And they might think maybe what's going on a bit here is there's an ideology that's maybe the state helps use, but is largely independent of the apparatus of the state that stops these people from accumulating wealth. So discrimination against these groups and what have you. And so to think that it's largely just the state that creates these classes is to miss, this large cultural, social explanation. So what's the left libertarian response to that, or how do they incorporate that insight?
I mean, there's division among left libertarians on this issue.
What's your take, I guess?
Because I'll just say I know some left libertarians who remind me a bit of vulgar Marxists in the sense of saying, really, it's just the state. Sort of the left libertarian analog of vulgar Marxists. It's just the state. It's just the and I don't think that's the case. I definitely think that culture and ideology and so forth matter. And also, of course, I don't think that the state is the only form of violence. Particularly if we're talking about gender politics. A lot of the violence that male violence against women is not made by the state. It's sort of freelance violence that helps to maintain power and balance between men and women. And I don't discount that. But I think that having the market incentives as opposed to government incentives is very effective in combating it, even if it's not all you need. And here's a distinction I'd want to make. So a lot of libertarians are going to say, when they talk about discrimination, a lot of them are going to say, look, discrimination is costly because if you're if you're not hiring the best people or having the best customers, then it hurts you economically, and so the market incentives will just. This
is like Gary Becker and Milton Friedman's mistake.
And I think that's overstated. I think that because there are, I think there is a way that market helps to solve that problem, but not quite the way people think, because a lot of people, if they're prejudiced and their peer group is also prejudiced, they may not want to go against their peer group. Suppose that you're living in you're a white guy living in a racist white community, and you want to pay your black employees more, or you want to accept black customers to get more money, but then that you're going to be shunned by your white peer group. You might not do it. I think that the attraction, the way that the economic thing works, is not so much, and often the way that economics breaks up cartels in general, because this is a kind of a racial cartel, is not so much that it leads members of the cartel to cheat on each other, because often they have non-monetary reasons to hang together, but then it brings in outsiders who aren't part of that culture. So here's a story about my grandmother. So my grandmother lived in, she wasn't from Florida. She was from Chicago. She moved to Florida in the 1940s, maybe, at Daytona Beach, and she paid her black servants way more than her white neighbors did. Not because she wasn't racist. She was racist as hell, but her flavor of racism was different from the local flavor. And she didn't do it just to get the best employees, although, in fact, that was the result and caused all the neighbors to complain. She did it just because she thought it was unclassy to pay people below a certain level. It was below her dignity to pay people that little. It's some image of I don't know what. So anyway, so her motives were not ideal, but at any rate, as a matter of fact, she did get economic benefits from getting the best of the local black employees, because she wasn't part of this local group. She wasn't planning to live forever in Florida. She didn't identify with this peer group. She didn't give a crap what they thought about anything. And so as I said, she wasn't motivated primarily by the economic incentives. That was probably part of it. And so I think in general, economic incentives break up cartels more successfully by luring competitors in from the outside than necessarily from breaking up the cartel from within. So I think those things can be effective, but also I think we shouldn't think of the market as just a matter of sitting back and letting the price system take care of things. I mean, I think the price system is amazing. It can, in fact, take care of lots and lots of things. But also, I think we think of the markets as sort of the totality of free exchanges, not all free exchanges are just matters of, I want to maximize my monetary profit or something like that. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a vital role for, deliberate social action to try and change the culture. And, I think, I think that, even if people weren't like that, I think if everyone were just sort of robotic profit maximizers, I think that, the market would solve these things pretty well. But as long as you've got, a lot of people who are being driven by bad non-monetary incentives, it's really crucial to have people driven by good non-monetary incentives to combat it. And so I think that, that's one of the reasons I think that, libertarians shouldn't focus just on getting rid of state intervention, even though I think state intervention is a huge part of the story, but that they should also be focused on getting involved in these kinds of solidarity movements, and precisely the sorts of things that intersectional feminists and race theorists and so forth are interested in. So, so I think that although we're a lot more optimistic than a lot of sort of more traditional leftists are about the power of markets and so forth, nevertheless, I think that these other movements are absolutely crucial too, and we should be supporting them.
Right, that's very good. I guess that's enough on the distinguishing features of libertarian class theory. Maybe we can go into the normative motivations for that project. Maybe we can go into what we care about with egalitarianism. I think you have a paper called Egalitarianism, the Unknown Ideal. I realized I just accidentally gave the title of Liz Anderson's paper, which is a slightly different account of yours. But what sort of egalitarianism do you buy into? What do you think the point of distributive justice is? And why, there's this classic, libertarian view that distributive justice is, to paraphrase Hayek, a mirage of some sorts. That we shouldn't care about it because free exchange can create unequal wealth distributions, even if the free exchange is completely valid. Yeah. Like Nozick made that argument with his Will Chamberlain example. So why should we care about?
Yeah, and I should say that my views have evolved somewhat since I wrote that article.
Oh, they have. Okay.
I'm not sure I disagree with anything I said in that article, but probably sort of the range of kinds of equality I'm interested in is probably greater than that now. So what I said back in that article was that the libertarian conception of freedom is itself a form of egalitarianism.
Right.
The idea was equality of authority, an idea that goes back to Locke. When Locke and Jefferson say that we're all created equal, what they mean is what the kind of equality they have in mind is equality of authority. No one has the right to tell anyone else what to do.
And that's something that most liberal theories share in general.
In principle, but they end up supporting an organization that, so one criticism of the state is an organization that is unequal. Mm-hmm. There's this massive, so people think of the state's job is to ensure equality among the governed, but the question is, what about equality between the governed and the governors? That there's this inequality in power, and you can say, well, if it's a democratic state, then somehow it's really all just us, or we control it, or we rotate into and out of it, and so forth. But in practice, you end up getting some people with political office, or people with private political influence, or people with badges and guns and truncheons, end up being in a position to impose stuff on us that we can't impose, that we don't have a comparable right to impose back on them. So there's a sense in which just the basic libertarian conception of freedom is itself a form of egalitarianism. But that's not. But I wouldn't limit my egalitarianism to that. So I think that's a very important form of egalitarianism. It would be worthwhile having that, even if we didn't get the kind of wealth equality that I would expect. But I see, the wealth equality that I expect. I also think it's valuable in its own right. People often say, a lot of right libertarians say, well, look, it's not the degree of equality of wealth that matters. All that matters is sort of
how it was attained.
Yeah. Well, also they'll say what matters is as long as it's going up, it doesn't matter.
Right.
and I think they're half right in the sense that my ideal would not my ideal to getting rid of wealth inequality would not be if I could do it by sort of reducing everyone to the to equal level of poverty or something like that. But of course that's not what So take something like Rawls's principle,
right,
which is that you have that deviations from equality are fine so long as the worst off people are better off than they would be under equality. So that's not the kind of egalitarianism that wants us all to be sort of reduced to that would get rid of equality by reducing us all to some sort of Harrison Bergeron equality. Now I don't so I think that there is a genuine a lot of libertarians say that they don't see any value
in anything like that distributive justice.
Yes,
conception.
And I see some value to it. I certainly don't think it's the whole story of justice. I don't think that it trumps the kinds of property rights considerations that someone like Nozick has, but I think that there is suppose we all became fantastically much more wealthy than we are, but it was still massively unequal. I think there'd be a problem. I mean, I'd take it, but there'd be a problem because how we relate to each other in society, what kinds of opportunities we have to interact, and the possibility of sort of being left out of things.
The relational egalitarianism of Liz Anderson is what you have in mind?
Maybe something like that. Yeah. And of course, to a lot of right libertarians, it's just going to sound like envy. But it's not envy in the sense of, I resent you from having more and I want to take it away from you. It's like, I want to be sort of a full participant in this society. Now, how does the value of that kind of concern relate to the value of something like, Nozickian rights? Well, this is where my Aristotelianism comes in.
Okay. So,
the Aristotelian view, at least as I interpret the idea of the unity of virtue,
right,
is that so the traditional way of putting the idea of unity of virtue is that you can't have one virtue completely without having them all. The strong version of it is that there's all the virtues, just different names for one virtue. That's like Socrates' view. That's not Aristotle's view. Aristotle's view is different virtues.
To be courageous, you will also
to be fully courageous.
To be fully, or I guess a better example is given is to be fully benevolent in certain situations. You're going to have to do the courageous thing, so you have to be courageous.
Yeah. So the idea is that if you're, so the idea is he doesn't rule out the possibility that you could be like 70% benevolent or only 40% courageous or something like that. I think that he would allow that, but you couldn't be 100% benevolent without being 100% courageous, because there are going to be cases where doing the benevolent thing requires facing some kind of danger or whatever. But for me, the most important point about the unity of virtue is not just that you can't have one without having them all, but that you can't settle what it means. You can't settle what courage requires of you without figuring out what benevolence requires of you, and vice versa. So that the contents of the virtues are interdefined. Each one has some sort of provisional content to begin with. But as you work out the details, there's a kind of mutual adjustment to come up with their content. So I think that there are, so there are some virtues that are, that are sort of very much social consequence oriented, like benevolence, and there's some that are much more sort of deontic rights oriented, like justice. But if those two are standing in relationship with sort of reciprocal determination, that means that in filling out in one, you also have to fill in the other, so that you may have to adjust the content of justice to fit consequentialist concerns, but also you may have to adjust the concept of what counts as a good result by concerns of justice.
Okay, so that's a really fascinating... I hadn't heard you make that argument for it. And that's a really fascinating use of the unity of virtue, which is a doctrine that I'm generally skeptical of, because I'm not much of an Aristotelian myself. But one objection that comes to mind to that is that, well, it doesn't look like we need to fully conceptually spell out what a just distributive society is. I guess the way you cashed out was in terms of benevolent. What a benevolently distributive society would be, although in the literature it's usually talked about in terms of justice, but since we're in virtue theory now, we should keep those two distinct, I guess.
Well, except I'm saying that benevolence feeds into determining the content of justice. So.
All right, that's the claim.
Yeah.
And it looks to me like if what we mean by justice here is like non-aggression libertarian stuff, that, you know, what justice demands of you is that you don't initiate force or fraud, blah, 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 in illegitimate ways, it doesn't look like you need to make much reference to distributive justice to know what that is. And a Rawlsian would push back to say, well, I don't really need to refer to a theory of property rights to know what a just society looks like distributively. So it looks like, why would we think that there's this important sort of conceptual link to them in this unity of virtue way?
Well, there are, you know, so there are different ways of specifying the general libertarian principles. You've got very general libertarian principles about rights and so forth. There are different ways of specifying the details. And likewise, you can have, you know, general concerns about distributive justice and different ways of specifying the details. And the idea is that, you know, each one has some content of its own. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't start off as a blank slate. Because if they all start off as blank slates, then trying to mutually adjust blank slates wouldn't get you anywhere. But the idea is that it's reasonable to take these distributive concerns into account when choosing among different ways of instantiating the basic libertarian principles, and vice versa.
So give me some examples.
So, all right. So here's, you know, so this isn't really sort of a matter of social policy. It's more a social matter of sort of individual action. But, you know, questions like, you know, is it all right to steal bread when you're starving or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
And the, you know, so there's one right libertarian view would say no, it's your duty to starve. There was, back in the 90s, the Liberty magazine had this poll where they asked people if you are falling out of a building and you or to grab onto someone else's balcony to prevent yourself from falling to your death, mm-hmm. and they say, get off my balcony, are you obligated to let go and fall to your death? And there was a significant percentage that said yes. And in fact, that example ended up getting incorporated into one of L. Neil Smith's science fiction mm-hmm. libertarian novels, where he seemed to endorse that position. And so the question is, well, you know, that's one interpretation of the libertarian principle, but you could also have the interpretation that in a situation like that, what you owe them is maybe something like reparation afterward, but not actually, you know, so maybe, you know, or if you know, breaking into someone's cabin to avoid freezing to death or something, you know, should we say that you're just required to die, or can we say that in emergency situations it's all right to make use of their property, but then you should do your best if possible to make restitution to them later, and say, well, in choosing among those different interpretations, it makes sense to take into account, you know, considerations of benevolence and welfare and so forth, and as you choose the, you know, the less creepy answers to those questions. That would be an example. And likewise, in terms of, let's say, there are different ways of interpreting land rights. So, what exactly?
Occupancy and use versus homesteading, or what?
Yeah, and also things like, you know, even in cases where you don't actually get full property title to something, what do you have to do in order to get an easement? So there are some libertarians who will say, well, look, if someone buys up all the land around your house, well, you should have contractually acquired an easement before that. If you didn't, well, you know, you're just out of luck. You can just come in and out by helicopter. You know, versus the view that, you know, well, no, by buying up all the land around your house, not letting you out, they're imprisoning you, and so they're violating your liberty. So those are two different ways of interpreting libertarian principle. Well, it's legitimate to bring in social welfare considerations, to choose, you know, which of those, you know, to choose between them. And it would say, well, in light of those, it'll be more reasonable to take the one that they have to give you an easement. And likewise, I'm talking about things like Native American land rights, where some people say, well, look, in the cases of the nomadic tribes, who, you know, maybe they weren't altering their landscape enough to get full ownership, So could you just grab all that stuff that they hunted over, or were they entitled to an easement at least over the areas that they hunted, even if they didn't have full property rights? And you could say, well, in terms of, you know, if you take benevolence seriously, but it's going to be in favor of giving them an easement as opposed to what actually happened. Though of course, what actually happened was, even Indian tribes that had farms and settled land and stuff that would clearly have been private property by standard Lockean views. The government took that too, so it wasn't as though the government was just sort of misapplying libertarian principles. But
right.
But some libertarians have argued, well, at least for the nomadic tribes, the nomadic tribes didn't have any property rights, so you could just take whatever. And I think that's going to be a less plausible interpretation once you bring in benevolence to choose among these different interpretations of libertarian principle.
Right. That's really interesting. Another thing that came to mind is it's pretty uncontroversial among mainstream political philosophers, as I take it, to adjust one's view of distributive justice in light of other justice considerations. Like the famous objection to egalitarianism is it would require continual interventions into your life in problematic ways that violate liberal justice to correct for bad luck. Like maybe we need to control how people parent their kids or what have you. All right, I think that's really interesting. The other thought that I have when you apply the doctrine of virtue to try to link these a thick conception of distributive justice with a thinner libertarian view is one might think that virtue theory is something that should only apply to individuals. When we talk about the virtue of courage, benevolence, blah blah blah, that's something that works with individuals. It doesn't really apply to whole societies, to whole polities. And it would be some sort of fallacy to start applying virtues to society. So why should we be using a doctrine like unity of the virtue to try to link features that we want societies to have when they're not really virtues proper?
Well, all these decisions are made by individuals. Mm-hmm. So anyone who's implementing, anyone who's acting, doing a role in being part of a legal system or something, whether they're a judge or a legal theorist or some kind of law enforcement person or rights protector, whatever they are, all the people who are the agents of the legal system, be it a state or some kind of something more anarchic, they're individuals, and the individual conduct is governed by the virtues. And everything the state does ultimately, or whatever any legal system, state or anarchic does, is happens in virtue of individuals making decisions, and they're always going to be governed by these virtue considerations. So, you don't get off the hook for following the virtues just because you're acting as an agent of a legal system. So, now of course, the traditional virtue theorists, they thought of the purpose of the state as to promote virtue, and so they were very paternalistic and intrusive. Not all of them as paternalistic and intrusive as Plato's Republic.
This is like Aristotle's Politics.
Yeah, so Aristotle's Politics, it looks very libertarian compared to Plato's Republic, but it looks a lot like Plato's Republic compared to libertarianism. But I think that what they failed to think about was they were thinking about virtue as something to promote, but they were forgetting about the ways in which virtue should constrain the behavior of the people running the system. And so, suppose that I think that there's this value of respect that you owe to all other people. It's something a lot of the ancient virtue theorists, sometimes seem to think and sometimes not. Of course, Aristotle explicitly didn't think that. He thought that they were natural slaves. But you got people like Cicero who says, we're all equal parts of this. Well, he didn't say equal, but we're all parts of humanity, and everyone deserves respect and so forth. But he had no problem with slavery. He never explained it. But they think that there's this value of respect, and so they would think, therefore, it's the job of the state to promote it, to make people respectful. But you have to say, well, look, the state is going to be doing this in virtue of individuals doing various things, and they're bound by that respect too. And so you can't promote respect in ways that violate respect. So the idea that the natural political implementation of virtue ethics is a state that promotes virtue is a mistake, because virtue requires taking an attitude toward other people that's inconsistent with the kind of paternalistic micromanaging that the traditional virtue ethical state was favoring.
So what I had in mind by giving voice to that objection was something somewhat different. I had in mind, like, Hayek in The Fatal Conceit. Argues that we need to apply a different sort of, maybe putting it in terms of whether virtue applied to societies or state institutions was the wrong way to give voice to this line. But I had in mind that, Hayek in The Fatal Conceit says that we now live in such a large, complicated society that we have to apply different ways of thinking about ethics, maybe different virtues to our lives and our intimate orders and our intimate groupings, like families, relationships, blah, 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 as opposed to the extended order of society, the world out there. And maybe we could catch this out in terms of virtue ethics by thinking about, like, how a lawyer has to exhibit virtues to different degrees and in different ways when he's arguing his court case as opposed to when he's talking to his wife. The lawyer who, and this is a very non-Aristotelian way of thinking about it as I see it, the lawyer.
Well, it's a very Ciceronian way of thinking about it.
Maybe the lawyer who were to treat his court case the way he treats a discussion with his wife would very likely lose the court case. Whereas if he were to go home and get in this combative debate with his wife, he'd probably get a divorce very quickly, and we would view him as not a good husband, and we would view him as not a good lawyer in the other case. So why would we think that the way virtues work the same in the political realm as they do in the public space as they do in the private space of our intimate group lives?
Well, I mean, certainly, it's part of virtue to recognize that one and the same virtue will have different manifestations in different social contexts. I think that's sort of part of virtue ethics forever. There's this, often disagreement of what those contexts are. I agree that there are differences in these contexts, but I think that people have tended to be too comfortable with allowing radical differences, like basically all the things that cops are allowed to do. Right. But also, take another example that's sort of similar to your example, which I think is partly right and partly wrong. So in business ethics, there's this famous article by Albert Carr, I think called is it Business Bluffing or something like that. It's got bluffing in the title. It often appears in business ethics textbooks, where he says you don't use the same ethics in business that you would do in dealing with personal friends and family. He operates according to a different set of rules, which I think to some extent is right. But then but he takes it to the sense of saying, look, it's like poker, where in poker they're trying to deceive you, and by playing the game you sort of consented to their deceiving you. And so likewise, when you're in business, when you're engaging in economic transactions in the market, they're trying to deceive you, and you've sort of consented to that by entering these economic transactions, which really seems and it's not just they don't have to, it's not just that they don't have to be as benevolent to you as you would be a family member, but actually that they can deceive you as long as they don't actually sort of actively lie and so forth. They can manipulate you and so forth. And I think it's just wrong. This idea that we've consenting to play a poker game. I mean, there's no such thing as consenting to engage in economic trade in the market. You just have to do it in order to survive. And so the idea, really it sounds more like sort of the social contract argument that somehow by just living in a place you've consented all kinds of crap from the government. Likewise, this idea that by living in a place you've consented all this kind of crap from business people. So so I think there's a limit to how far you can have these different roles mean different ethics things. Now, of course, part of Hayek's idea was, it doesn't make any sense to talk about. He said it doesn't make any sense to talk about the justice of distribution, because justice applies to only the actions of individuals and doesn't apply to spontaneous orders. But of course, you can talk about. You can always talk about the justice of a distribution into talk about the justice of what individuals, either individually or in concert with each other, should do in response to an existing distribution. So you can always talk about social justice and talk about what individuals should do.
But at that point, haven't you just conceded the point and gotten rid of the distributive justice and gone just back to the
No, because I think it's saying what people justly should do in response to a distribution, given distribution, whether they should try and change that distribution or not. I think that's an issue of distributive justice.
Okay.
And now it's true that sort of there's a kind of communism that can work at the level of the family that I think can't work at the level of society as a whole.
Right. That's what I also think Hayek had.
And that's fine. That's right. And in fact, if you try to apply it at the level of society as a whole, you'll cause, starvation and chaos. And if you're benevolent, you don't want to do that. And so
the rest of that quote is, if we applied the ethics to our intimate groupings, we would demolish them, and if we applied it to the intimate grouping ethics to the extended order, we would destroy it.
Yeah. So benevolence. Benevolence is when a simple-minded application of benevolence to the wider social order would have horrific results, then a nuanced understanding of benevolence would say, well, don't do that. But nevertheless, I don't think that's a reason to think that there's no reason to be concerned about systematic inequalities of wealth, or thinking that it's just not a problem. Now, if it's true that the only way we could get rid of them is by some sort of intrusive violation of people's property rights, then I'm saying, all right, well, I guess then the world sucks. We don't want to do that. But to the extent that you can combat these kinds of inequalities, without violating libertarian rights, I think we should. It's a better society if more people can participate on an equal basis. Part of it's just that societies work better when more people's ideas can be can enter into the competition. And if there's a vast inequality of wealth between one group and another, then the lower group they may be living comfortably, but they're not able to participate as much in that conversation. And I think the society as a whole suffers from that.
Yeah, and not to mention that there might be something intrinsically wrong with excluding people from the conversation.
Yes.
Who would otherwise want to participate in it. Or excluding people from certain social practices, certain cultural rights, etc.
Yeah, I mean, so that it's So if you're, take the following example. There are sometimes people who say things like, well, you shouldn't care if you're excluded. I'm going to take an extreme example. A lot of people say, well, black people shouldn't complain about the legacy of slavery because if the slavery never happened, then they would have been born back in Africa instead of here, and so they'd be living in much worse poverty. Because actually they would never have been born at all, because history would have meant that different parents meant. But anyway,
we don't need to get into modal identity here.
Yeah, but anyway, the
trans-world identity.
Treating people like crap is not justified by the fact that your ability to do it is made possible by a series of events such that had they happened otherwise, that those persons would have been worse off. It's like if I come up to you and I punch you in the face and you fall over, and then by sheer luck, that means that you end up not being hit by a bullet that someone else was firing. Because I've actually benefited you by punching you in the face. I wasn't trying to benefit you, but as a matter of fact, you're better off. So now I might say, instead of me owing you, for punching you in the face, you owe me for saving you from the bullet. No. And so likewise, if people are excluded, when people are excluded from things, you could say, well, yeah, but under this regime where they're excluded, they're much better off, much more comfortable than they would have been before. Well, it's great. Want to keep them comfortable? Good. We don't want to impoverish everyone in the name of equality. But if people, if people are excluded from things, it's just not a respectful way to treat people. And doesn't mean that you need all the bunch of stuff to solve it imposed by law, because that's also not a respectful way to treat people. But happily, that's not the only way we can deal with it.
The last question I always like to ask is, what are 3 works, could be books, articles, documentaries, what have you, that people, you think the listeners should read pertaining to this, or generally to learn more about what you're interested in?
Okay, so so basically on class theory, libertarian class theory, 3 books I'd recommend. So one is an anthology of I was a co-editor of it, along with David Hart and Gary Chartier and Ross Kenyon. And it's titled, what the hell is it titled? Something like Social Class and State Power, an Alternative Radical Theory, or something like that.
Exploring an alternative radical tradition.
That sounds right. So, Social Class and State Power, Exploring an Alternative Radical Tradition. And it's just a collection of various works in classical liberal class theory, both more lefty ones and more righty ones, from basically from the 17th century through today. So it gives a range of different versions. Then, specifically on the French liberal class theorists, in particular Charles Comte, Charles Dunoyer, and Augustin Thierry, who wrote this journal in early 19th century France that developed a lot of these ideas early on. David Hart on his website has his he's got a couple of different versions of his dissertation, and it's got a couple of different titles depending on the version, but most of them have either as the title or as the subtitle something like The Radical Liberalism of Charles Comte and Charles Dunoyer. And that's useful because the class theory book that I mentioned before doesn't have stuff from them. Well, it has like a little snippet or something, but hardly anything from them has been translated. And so it's a really useful account of them. And then the third thing, for more specifically the kind of class theory that left libertarians go in for these days, there's another anthology, Markets Not Capitalism, right, by Gary Chartier and Charles Johnson, that has a bunch of mostly, it has a few older things like stuff from Benjamin Tucker in the 19th century, but it's mostly recent, like from the last 20 years, left libertarian analysis of the interaction between state power and the power of big business and the corporate elite. And so those are 3 things that come to mind. All right.
Well, Roderick Long, thank you for coming on the show. We hope to have you on again.
Thanks. I enjoyed it.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I'd like to thank Roderick again for coming onto the show and setting aside that afternoon at that busy conference for a really interesting and in-depth discussion. As I mentioned earlier, if you like this show and you want to support what we do, you can support us on Patreon. If you decide to do so, you get special bonus content and swag as a thank you for your support, including bonus roundtable episodes. There was recently a roundtable we did with Roderick, as well as 2 other guests we had on the show before, Kevin Carson and William Gillis, about the founding of the Center for a Stateless Society. So you can check that out. You will also get free books, buttons, and zines, depending on how much you donate, as well as the potential for special credit at the end of our show for helping out. If any of that sounds appealing to you, or if you just want to support us on having these type of conversations, you can go to patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's patreon.com/c4ss.org.